The check-in happened at 11 p.m. on a Thursday in March, which was the earliest Claire could arrange it without raising questions from the overnight admissions staff. Vivian Ashworth walked into Mercy General Hospital through the main entrance rather than the emergency bay, which Claire had recommended because the main entrance had better lighting and fewer people who might recognize her. She was wearing a coat she had bought 2 years ago and almost never wore dark gray, oversized, the kind of coat that does not look like it belongs to a woman whose photograph appeared on the cover of a business magazine 4 months prior. She had her hair down. She had not put on makeup. She had not gone without makeup to a public place in 3 years. She noticed this in the elevator and filed it away as information about herself that she was not yet ready to examine. Claire met her at the elevator on the 4th floor with a chart already prepared and a look on her face that Vivian recognized as the expression Claire, reserved for situations where she wanted to say several things but had decided to say none of them. Room 43, Claire said. I'll be on call until 6. The admissions note says threatened miscarriage. Monitoring required. Minimal disruption protocol. Thank you, Vivian said. You don't have to thank me. A pause. The attorney's number is in the Notes app on your phone under the name Alan Park, like he's my brother, which he is not, but Preston doesn't know that. Vivian almost smiled. 48 hours, Claire said. That's what we have. I know. Use them. The room was small and clean and smelled of antiseptic, with an undertone of something floral that Vivian identified, after a moment, as the lily arrangement Preston had sent ahead. He had called the hospital that afternoon, after she told him about the miscarriage scare, to arrange for flowers to be waiting in her room. She had not told him which room she would be in. He had found out anyway. She asked the night nurse to move the flowers to the far corner of the room. The nurse did so without comment. Preston arrived at 11:40. He had driven himself, which meant he had not wanted a driver to know where he was going at this hour, which Vivian noted and filed. He came in, carrying a second set of flowers, and sat down in the chair beside her bed, and took her hand, and said the things you say when your wife is in the hospital. His voice was warm. His eyes were concerned. He was, as he had always been, in public and in the first year of their marriage, entirely convincing. Vivian lay with her eyes half closed and listened to the quality of his voice rather than the content of it, which was something she had started doing 18 months ago without fully understanding why. The quality of his voice when he was performing concern for an audience was slightly higher in register, slightly more varied in cadence. The quality when they were alone was flatter, more efficient. He did not waste expressiveness when there was no one to receive it. Tonight, they were alone, and his voice was doing the higher register anyway. She understood, lying there, that she had become an audience. He stepped out twice to take calls. Both times, she heard his footsteps stop just outside the door rather than moving down the hall, which meant he was staying close enough to hear if she made a call of her own. The second time, through the door, she caught 2 words clearly, a name, Calloway, and a deadline, Friday. Calloway, she would later confirm, was the name of Preston's personal attorney, the one separate from the firm they used together. Friday was the deadline on the restructuring documents. When he came back the second time, he sat down and placed his hand over hers and said he was planning to work from home the entire following week. To be with you, he said. While you recover. His thumb moved across her knuckles. She kept her eyes at half-mast and thought, there is no recovery to oversee. We both know that. The question is whether you know that I know. Before he left, he reached across her to adjust the blanket, and in doing so, his eyes moved to her phone on the bedside table. It was a glance of less than a second, the practiced motion of someone who had been checking her phone for 5 years and had long since integrated it into normal movement so that it looked like nothing. She had seen it hundreds of times. She had never named it before tonight. After he left, the room was very quiet. The monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Vivian lay still and did what she had come here to do, she thought. Not about Preston. She had spent 5 years thinking about Preston, trying to understand him, trying to anticipate him, trying to locate the version of him she had married inside the version she was living with. She was done thinking about Preston. She thought about herself. She thought about the woman who had started a company at 24 in a one-bedroom apartment with a laptop and a spreadsheet and a belief so total it had frightened her own mother that she could make the thing work. She thought about the woman who had sat across the table from investors twice her age and held her position when they pushed back, not because she was aggressive, but because she had done the work and she knew it, and she refused to pretend otherwise. She tried to locate that woman inside the woman lying in this hospital bed who had needed to fake a miscarriage to find 48 hours of unmonitored thinking time. The distance between the two felt very large. She was still measuring it when the door opened. Rosa Delgado knocked once before entering, which was more than most of the overnight staff had bothered with. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, with dark hair pulled back and the bearing of someone who has spent decades in spaces where invisibility is both a job requirement and a survival strategy. She moved through the room with the economy of someone who has done this work long enough that it requires no conscious direction, wiping surfaces, replacing the trash liner, checking the bathroom, moving from one task to the next in a sequence so practiced it had the quality of something choreographed. She did not make eye contact with Vivian. She did not make conversation. She was, in the way that overnight cleaning staff in hospitals are almost always invisible to the patients and families who move through the same spaces, simply present. Vivian had her eyes closed. She was not asleep. She heard Rosa's cart stop near the door. A pause longer than the pause before someone leaves, shorter than the pause before someone makes a decision. Rosa spoke without turning around. Her voice was low, with a Salvadoran accent that softened the consonants and gave the words a careful, deliberate quality. "I know you're not sleeping," she said, "and I know you didn't have a miscarriage." Vivian did not move. She kept her breathing even. "The man who was here earlier." A pause. "I need to know if you're safe, because my daughter used to work near him, and for 7 months I haven't been able to find her." The door opened. The cart moved into the hallway. The door settled most of the way closed, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 inches, enough for a thin line of hallway light to fall across the floor, enough to hear the cart moving away down the corridor, the sound diminishing until it disappeared around the corner toward the nurse's station. Vivian lay in the dark. Her phone was in her hand. She had been holding it since Preston left, the screen dark, the number of Claire's attorney contact already in her recent searches. She had not called yet because calling meant deciding, and deciding meant acknowledging that what she was afraid of was real rather than a construction of her own anxiety, which was the framing Preston had given her stress responses for so long that she had partially adopted it herself. She looked at the gap of light under the door. She thought about the word safe, which was such a simple word that it should have been easy to answer, and was not. She thought about a woman she had never met named Lucia, who had apparently disappeared from every form of communication 7 months ago, and whose mother was now somewhere in this hallway. She thought about the fact that a stranger, a woman who cleaned rooms at 11 p.m., had looked at her and seen what she was actually doing here, when the man who had shared her bed for 5 years had looked at her and seen only what he needed her to be. She did not call the attorney that night, but she did not sleep either. She lay in the dark with the line of hallway light across the floor and thought, for the first time in a long time, with the full unmonitored clarity of a mind, that no one was watching. At 2 in the morning, Vivian heard the cart in the hallway. She had been awake the entire time, not restlessly, not with the anxiety of someone waiting for something, but with the focused quietness of someone who has decided to stop pretending. She sat up when she heard the cart stop outside her door. She reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. By the time Rosa knocked and entered, Vivian was sitting upright against the pillows, looking directly at the door. Rosa stopped just inside the threshold. She looked at Vivian for a moment, reading the room, the way someone reads rooms when their circumstances have required it for a long time. Then she stepped fully in and let the door close behind her. "Your daughter's name," Vivian said. "What is it?" Rosa set her cart against the wall. She sat down in the chair beside the bed without asking permission, without hesitation, the way people sit when they have been waiting a long time for a specific moment and are not willing to waste it on formality. "Lucia," she said, 26 years old. She was working as an executive assistant at your fund, on paper, reporting to you, but in practice, she took direction from your husband. February through September of last year. Then, one day, I stopped receiving her daily message. Her phone number stopped working. Her accounts were deleted. She reached into the pocket of her uniform and took out her phone. She turned it toward Vivian. The photograph showed a young woman with Rosa's eyes and a smile that suggested someone who had not yet learned to be careful about how openly she showed things. She was standing in front of a building Vivian recognized immediately. The former offices of Ashworth Capital on Meridian Avenue, the address they had vacated 8 months ago. Vivian looked at the photograph. She remembered Lucia now, or she remembered the outline of her. A young woman, quick and bright, who had appeared at her office door once with a question about a document, and whom Vivian had redirected to Preston because she was in the middle of something, and Preston handled the staff. She remembered thinking, in that brief moment, that the young woman seemed competent. She did not remember what the question had been. She had not known the young woman's name. 8 months later, sitting in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and someone else's flowers, she understood that this was not a small thing. She wasn't the first, Rosa said. I spent 4 months finding that out. In 3 years, 4 women, all young, all in positions with access to sensitive information, all gone within a few months, and none of them reachable afterward. She put the phone away. I found 2 of them. One wouldn't speak to me. She just said she had signed something and couldn't. The other sent me one text. Don't dig further. Then, she blocked my number. What were they signing? Vivian asked. Non-disclosure agreements. Broad ones. Severance in exchange for silence about their time at the fund and their interactions with its principals. Rosa's voice was even, factual. The voice of someone who had assembled this over months and had long since passed through the emotional stages of it. The agreements were signed under your name. Vivian Ashworth, principal and founder. The room was very still. Vivian heard the monitor. She heard the ventilation. She heard, distantly, someone in the hallway in a low professional exchange. She thought about the stack of documents she reviewed and signed each month, the administrative rhythm of running a fund, the contracts and compliance filings and personnel papers that moved through her inbox with regularity. Preston had taken over the coordination of that paperwork 3 years ago, when she had been occupied with a significant portfolio review. He had framed it as support. She had accepted it as support. She had continued signing what was placed in front of her with the understanding that the material had already been reviewed by someone she trusted. The word trusted sat differently in her mind now than it had 30 minutes ago. She thought about what trust looks like when it is used as a mechanism rather than felt as a condition. She had seen this in business dealings, the performative version, deployed specifically to lower someone's guard. She had recognized it in others. She had not recognized it in her own home, in her own marriage, applied to herself, for 5 years. Rosa stayed for almost 2 hours. She did not tell the story in order. She told it the way she had assembled it in pieces, presenting each fragment and letting Vivian draw the connections, not because she was being strategic, but because that was how she had lived with it, one piece at a time, afraid to see the whole shape too quickly. She talked about Lucia's first weeks at the fund, the evening calls, the excitement, the way Preston had seemed charming and attentive, qualities that Rosa had found reassuring at the time. She talked about how, by the 3rd month, the evening calls had become weekly, then irregular, then stopped. She talked about the text messages that had come in the weeks before Lucia disappeared, brief, a little flat, nothing that would alarm a parent reading quickly. But Rosa had not read quickly. She had read carefully, and she had noticed that her daughter had stopped using certain words she always used and started using certain phrases she never used. The language had changed. Not the content, the texture. She was being careful, Rosa said. She knew someone might read her messages. She was telling me she was all right without being allowed to tell me anything else. Vivian listened and recognized something she had not named before, her own texture changes. The gradual narrowing of what she said to whom. The friends who had stopped calling because she had stopped calling back, which had happened so slowly, she had not noticed it as a process, only as a state. The opinions she had stopped volunteering. The version of herself that had grown smaller over 5 years, not because anyone had ordered her to be smaller, but because smallness had become the path of least resistance. She had thought of this as stress, as busyness, as the natural cost of a demanding life. She had not thought of it as a pattern with a source. The last thing she sent me, Rosa said, was not a text. She reached into her pocket, not her phone this time, but a folded piece of paper, small, worn, with the quality of something carried for a long time and handled frequently. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the bedside table. The handwriting was neat and small, in Spanish. One sentence. Vivian read it slowly. Mama, if I don't come back, find Mrs. Ashworth. She is the only one who can do something. She read it twice. She looked up at Rosa. She left this in her nightstand drawer, Rosa said. I found it when I collected her things, 2 weeks after she was gone. Vivian looked back at the paper. She thought about a 26-year-old woman writing this, deciding to write it, deciding what to say, deciding who to name in a moment when she was frightened enough that she felt she needed to leave instructions for the possibility of not returning. That woman had chosen to name her. Not investigators, not a lawyer, not a journalist or a friend. Vivian Ashworth. The woman whose name was on the door. The woman whose name was on every document. The woman who had, for 5 years, been so occupied with managing her own situation that she had not noticed what was being done in her name until a stranger sat in a chair at 2 a.m. and placed a folded piece of paper on her bedside table. She believed in you, Rosa said. It was not an accusation. It was simply true, stated the way you state things that are true and that the other person needs to hear. She believed you were a different person than what she was experiencing. She believed if you knew, you would do something. Vivian put the paper down on the table. She sat with that for a long time. Before she left, Rosa said one more thing. Her voice was quieter, more private, not the voice she had used to lay out the facts, but the voice of a woman explaining something she had thought about many times. I know you didn't have a miscarriage because I have cleaned this ward for 21 years, she said. I have sat with women who really lost something in these rooms. The way you held yourself, the way you looked at that man when he left, that is not grief. That is someone trying to figure out how to survive. She picked up her cart. I recognized it, she said, because I have felt it too. Claire came in early the following morning with coffee, and the expression she used when she had information that was going to change the shape of the conversation. She set the coffee on the table without comment, looked at Vivian's face, and sat down. He called Dr. Merritt yesterday afternoon, she said. Dr. Merritt was the attending psychiatrist on the 4th floor. Asked about the standard evaluation process for patients experiencing emotional instability following pregnancy loss. Framed it as a concerned husband wanting to understand what support might look like. Vivian held the coffee cup without drinking. Then this morning he called the department head, asked whether there were circumstances under which a patient's ability to make independent medical and financial decisions might be temporarily assessed if a family member had concerns about their mental state. The room was quiet. He's building a record, Claire said. It doesn't matter that there's no clinical basis for it. If he gets 2 signatures from physicians he's been cultivating, and he's been here twice now, talking to people, he doesn't need much. The threshold for a temporary conservatorship petition is lower than most people think, and his attorneys clearly know that. Vivian set the coffee down. She thought about this with the cold, analytical clarity that had been the engine of everything. She had built the same clarity that Preston had been working to erode for 5 years, by making her question whether her assessments were accurate, whether her perceptions were reliable, whether the things she noticed were real or the products of a mind that was, as he had occasionally suggested, with the gentlest possible concern, perhaps under too much pressure. She had come here to buy time. He had used the time she was buying to prepare a move she had not anticipated. It was, she thought, a well-constructed play. She had made better ones. How long before he can file anything? She asked. If he moves fast 48 hours from getting the second signature, then I have until tonight. Vivian looked at Claire. Call the attorney. Tell him I'm ready. Tell him to begin the account separation process this afternoon. I had already asked him to prepare the filings yesterday evening after our conversation, so he's ready to move, and tell him I need the corporate records for every personnel action at the fund in the last 3 years. Every termination, every severance agreement, every NDA. Claire left. Vivian sat in the silence and allowed herself, for approximately 5 minutes, to feel the full weight of what was happening. The grief of recognizing not just betrayal but complicity. The understanding that her name on those documents was not only a forgery of her intentions but also, in some ways, she was still tracing the edges of, a reflection of her own choices. The choice to trust without verifying. The choice to delegate without oversight. The choice, made quietly and repeatedly over 5 years, to accept the path of least resistance. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she picked up the phone and called the attorney herself. Preston arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 3 hours earlier than the visiting window they had agreed on, which was itself a message, a demonstration of the principle that agreements were frameworks he operated within when convenient and outside of when they were not. He came in with white roses. He sat down. He looked at her with the attending expression she knew so well, present, concerned, slightly tilted toward her as if she were the most important thing in the room, and said he had talked to Dr. Merritt that morning just to understand what she might be going through. "I know," Vivian said. A fractional pause. The pause of someone noting that a variable has changed. "He was very helpful," Preston continued. "He said, it's very common for women in your situation to experience." Preston. She said his name the way she said names across negotiating tables when she wanted people to understand that the preliminary portion of the conversation was finished. "I want to tell you something true." He looked at her. His expression did not change, which was itself a kind of information. A person who loved you and heard those words would have their expression change. "I read the email," she said. "The one from your attorney. The restructuring timeline. I read it 3 weeks ago. The evening you left your laptop open in the study." Nothing moved in his face. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what I had read. I told myself I was probably misunderstanding the legal language." She kept her voice level, the voice she used when she was presenting something that needed to be received clearly. "I've spent the last 3 weeks deciding whether I was misunderstanding it. I wasn't. Vivian, I know about the conversations you had here yesterday, with Dr. Merritt, with the department head." A pause. "I know what you were building toward." Preston was quiet. His hands were folded in his lap. He had the quality of absolute stillness that she had once found reassuring and now understood was not stillness at all but the suspension of a person deciding which move to make. "And I know about Lucia Delgado," she said, "and the 3 women before her, and the agreements that were signed with my name." The silence in the room was complete. She watched his face and saw the thing she had been afraid of seeing for 5 years, not rage, not grief, not the wounded confusion of someone wrongly accused. She saw calculation, the rapid, precise recalibration of a man who had encountered an obstacle he had not accounted for and was already mapping the routes around it. She had seen that look across many tables in her professional life. She had never allowed herself to see it in this room. "You're not well," he said. His voice had shifted into the register she thought of as the therapeutic register, warm, slowed, as if she needed extra time to process. "The stress of the last few days, the loss it's affecting your perception. What you think you read, what you think you know." Preston, his name again, the same weight. "I built a company from hundreds of millions of dollars of nothing. I have made 10,000 decisions under pressure. I know the difference between impaired perception and accurate assessment." She looked at him steadily. "I am not impaired. I am the clearest I have been in 5 years." Something shifted in his expression, a fraction of a degree, the kind of change only someone who had studied a face for a long time would catch. Not anger. The look of someone who has played a very long game and is recalculating whether the game is still winnable. "My attorney was contacted yesterday evening," Vivian said. "Not the one we used together, mine. The account separation process began this morning. The fund's corporate records have been requested, specifically every personnel action from the last 3 years." A pause. "By the time you speak to Calloway, the window you were planning to use will be closed." He was still for a long moment. Then he stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at the white roses he had brought, a long, almost contemplative look, and then he looked at her one final time. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I've made mistakes," Vivian said. "I know what they feel like. This isn't one." He left. The door closed. Vivian sat in the silence and breathed. Once, twice, 3 times, not controlled breathing, just the ordinary breathing of someone who has been holding themselves carefully for a long time and is now, finally, allowing their body to simply be in a room. She looked at the white roses on the table. They were very white and very careful, chosen for how they would look rather than what they would mean. She reached over and placed them face down in the trash. It was a small action. It took 3 seconds, but the weight of it was larger than its size. And she sat with that weight for a moment before she picked up her phone. She understood, in the quiet that followed, that the man who had just left did not love her. Not because he was incapable of love in some abstract sense, but because a person who loved you would not leave that way silently, immediately, already calculating the next position. A person who loved you would have stayed, would have argued, would have been hurt. Preston had left like a man who had closed one door and was looking for the next one. She was glad she had finally seen it clearly. That night, for the last time, Rosa came to clean the room. Vivian was sitting up in bed with her phone and a notepad, working through the list of calls she needed to make in the morning. She looked up when Rosa entered, and Rosa looked at her, taking in the posture, the notepad, the quality of a woman who had returned to herself, and gave a small nod that acknowledged something without naming it. They occupied the same space in companionable parallel for a while, two people doing what they were doing without requiring acknowledgement from each other, which felt to Vivian like a form of respect she had not encountered in a long time. When Rosa reached the bedside table, she paused. Lucia's note was still there. Vivian had not moved it. "I retained a private investigator this afternoon," Vivian said, "and a labor attorney who specializes in coerced severance agreements. They'll meet with you tomorrow at 10. The address is in this." She held out a folded piece of paper. "I won't be there. This is your story and Lucia's story. I'm not the right person to be in the room for it." Rosa took the paper. She looked at it, then at Vivian. "I'm also requesting the full personnel file for every action at the fund in the past 3 years," Vivian continued. "Every NDA, every termination. I don't know yet what I'll find, but I can promise I will not look away from it." Rosa folded the paper and placed it in her pocket. She did not say thank you. Vivian had not expected her to, and was glad thank you would have made it transactional, would have given Vivian credit she had not earned and did not want. What Rosa did instead was stand there for a moment, holding the folded paper, looking at Vivian with the expression of someone who has spent a very long time not trusting and is choosing, with full awareness of the risk, to try once more. "She likes yellow," Rosa said. "My daughter. When you find her, don't bring white flowers." Vivian held that. "I'll remember," she said. Rosa finished the room. At the door, she turned fully to look at Vivian one last time, not the quick functional glance of someone completing a task, but the full attention of one person looking at another. "You are not a bad person," she said. "You were a person who trusted wrong for too long. Those are not the same thing." She left. Vivian sat in the room that was now entirely hers, no performance required, no one monitoring the quality of her breathing or the direction of her gaze, and sat with what Rosa had said. Not a bad person. A person who trusted wrong for too long. She understood both things. She was not certain the distinction was as clean as Rosa had drawn it. She thought there were choices she had made that were not only about trust but about comfort, about the ease of not asking questions whose answers would require action. She would need to sit with that for a long time, but she was, for the first time in 5 years, asking the question without someone in the room telling her she was asking it wrong. That felt like the beginning of something. Lucia Delgado was found 11 days after the private investigator was retained. She was living in Tucson under her middle name, working a cash job at a plant nursery, and she had not been abducted or harmed. She had left voluntarily before dawn one September morning because she had come to believe that staying was more dangerous than disappearing. She had signed a non-disclosure agreement under conditions that a labor attorney would later describe in a legal filing as coercive and procedurally invalid. She had believed, as people in those circumstances often do, that she had no options. The investigator found her on a Tuesday. Rosa flew to Tucson on a Thursday. Vivian did not go. She sent yellow sunflowers to the address the investigator provided, not to Lucia, but to Rosa, with a note that said only, "For when you see her." She did not know whether Rosa had brought them to the reunion. She did not ask. The divorce proceedings were not quick and were not clean, which Vivian had expected. Preston's attorneys filed motions in the first 2 weeks designed to establish a narrative of her instability, the hospital stay, the sudden filing, the behavior of a woman under significant stress. Each motion was answered. The narrative did not hold. 3 of the 4 women who had signed NDAs ultimately came forward with statements, assisted by the labor attorney Vivian had retained. The 4th did not, and Vivian directed her legal team to leave that woman alone. Her choice was her choice. The corporate investigation took longer. What it found, documented across 3 years of personnel actions, was a pattern that Vivian's own name had been used to authorize and that Vivian had not, in the meaningful sense, authorized at all. Untangling the legal and moral dimensions of that would take time. She was not in a hurry. She wanted it done correctly, more than quickly. 2 of the 3 women who came forward eventually called her directly. One of those conversations lasted 40 minutes and was, for all its difficulty, one of the most useful professional conversations she had in the entire year, honest and specific and oriented toward what should be different, rather than only what had gone wrong. Preston faced civil proceedings on multiple fronts. Whether criminal charges would eventually follow remained unresolved at the point when Vivian decided to stop tracking it closely. She made that decision deliberately, after considerable thought, because the outcome of what happened to Preston was not something she could control. What she could control was what she built next. She chose to put her energy there. 3 months after her discharge from Mercy General Hospital, Vivian moved the fund's offices to a building on the north side of the city, smaller than the Meridian address, with more natural light and a conference room that looked onto a courtyard rather than a parking structure. She restructured the governance entirely. Every personnel decision required 2 independent signatories. Every severance agreement was reviewed by outside counsel before execution. She hired an operations director named Patricia, 51 years old, with a background in compliance and the quality of someone who had spent a career noticing what other people overlooked and gave her actual authority rather than the appearance of it. On her desk was a small vase of yellow sunflowers. She bought them every Monday from a flower stand on her way in. She had started doing it in April without much reflection. She had simply seen the color and stopped, and had continued stopping every Monday since. She did not examine the habit closely. Some things do not need to be examined to be worth keeping. Claire arrived one morning in June, as she occasionally did, with coffee and pastries from the bakery around the corner. They sat in the courtyard-facing conference room in the early light and ate without agenda, which was its own kind of luxury. Claire asked how she was. Vivian thought about it, taking the question seriously, the way she was trying to take more questions seriously. "I feel like I've been reintroduced to someone I used to know," she said. "And I'm not entirely sure yet what the current version of her is like. She's familiar, but I've missed a lot, so I'm paying attention." "That sounds right," Claire said. "It doesn't feel finished," Vivian said. "It's not supposed to feel finished," Claire said. "It's supposed to feel like work." Vivian looked out at the courtyard, where the morning light was coming in at a low angle across the plants, along the far wall. She did not know who had placed them there. They had appeared one morning, and she had made a note to find out and say something. "Then it feels like work," she said, "which is fine. I know how to do work." She turned back to the table. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the city was doing what it always did in the morning, waking up, beginning again, carrying forward the unfinished business of everything before, without pause, without waiting for anyone to feel ready. Vivian had always found that quality of cities clarifying, rather than overwhelming, the indifference of it. The way the forward motion continued regardless of what you had gotten wrong or right, and the only variable was whether you were moving with it or standing still, watching it go past. She was moving. She was not certain yet in exactly which direction, or what she would find when she got there. But she was asking the questions now, the right questions, to the right people, and listening to the answers even when they were inconvenient. That was enough for today. Tomorrow, she would ask again.